You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. We're back today with The Damp Man Returns by the great Allison V. Harding, the second of 3 stories concerning the titular character, which was published in the September 1947 edition of Weird Tales. For want of a better word, a man, but there the resemblance ends. See the video description for a link to the Harding playlist. And without further ado, The Damp Man Returns by Allison V. Harding. 1. To make a name for himself on a metropolitan paper, a reporter must have A. a terrific story, B. a terrific exclusive story, and C. a terrific exclusive story that his city editor will print. George Pelgrim mused on this as he sat in the Green Eaves Bar and Grill. He'd rung the bell on the first 2 requirements, but his editor on the Gazette, there was a tough baby. Pelgrim glanced at his wristwatch. In half an hour, he was meeting Linda. He took for the umpteenth time that day the Canadian postmarked envelope out of his pocket and looked at the letter from his uncle. As he read over again the penned words, headlines formed in his mind, and a first-page number 1 column story materialized. The Damp Man would be the identifying lead, and the story was as strange or stranger than any readers were likely to come across in our time. Pelgrim remembered the last time he'd seen the Damp Man, whose uncommon fixation on blonde and beautiful Linda Mallory was strange only because of its fanaticism and degree. He remembered the nightmarish quality of those moments in a northern Canadian town where the giant lumbering creature had pursued them through a park on a night so cold that the very air, as he and Linda sucked it in, seemed to be a congealed thing. And he recalled how the Damp Man was gaining and then suddenly lagged and stopped, sat down on a bench as though a man grown weary of the pace. With Linda safely away, George had come back through the still night, the only movement being the white plume of air as he exhaled. He could have sworn the Damp Man was a frozen thing now, and he remembered turning away from the rigid figure without conscience. It was fortunate that his uncle was a trustee of the hospital up there, and through him the strange reports filtered out. The reports were appalling, but they were true, if science is any yardstick of truth, and to George it meant the greatest story of his career. However, the reluctance of the Canadian press to issue 1 line of intelligence on the matter was matched by his own city editor down here on the Gazette. The whole episode was covered in a small item, stating merely that the multimillionaire Remsdorf Jr. was confined to a hospital in a small Canadian town, where he'd been visiting when taken ill. Lothar Remsdorf Jr. was the son and sole heir of the brilliant scientist who'd been destroyed in the mysterious explosion of his laboratory fully 2 decades ago. No trace of his body or unique scientific data had ever been found. "You're out of your mind," city editor McBrien had flayed at Pelgrim when George had hinted at the immensity of the story at hand. "Those interests," meaning Remsdorf, "are big enough to buy this sheet, big enough to buy you and me in this whole town, most of the country, too." McBrien went on to say the paper's publisher and owner would never stand for such a thing. This was one of the frustrations of the newspaper business, the "you can't print that" barrier. George wondered, though, if these things that his uncle discreetly reported to him in special delivery letters didn't sneak out even with scientists' ethics being what they are. For Lothar Remsdorf, the scion and offspring of millions, was no ordinary man. He was something else, impossible perhaps for even a scientific mind, much less the laity, to evaluate. Yet it had started simply enough. The removal of a man apparently completely frozen to the Canadian town's hospital morgue. In the morgue, this man had come to life again, but that can happen. Doctors have pronounced the undead dead before, and will again. It was the tests that told the strangest tale. For when Lothar Remsdorf was recuperating in the Northern Hospital, the routine yardsticks were applied to him as they are to all patients. It was then, so the secretly dispatched reports from his uncle revealed, that some astonishing discoveries were made. Lothar Remsdorf's veins, for instance, were not filled with blood, but with some subhemolytic fluid not far removed from the substances in a jellyfish. The average human, scientists know, is made up 2/3 of water. The damp man was 95% water. His organic functions, as they revealed their secrets one by one to the tests that were applied, were sluggish, slow-functioning machines beyond any conceivable range of normalcy or abnormalcy. His uncle, Pelgrim noticed, more than once commented on reports from the hospital that Remsdorf consumed fantastically extravagant quantities of fluids. Consequently, he required very little in the way of solid food. George put the envelope back in his pocket. He paid his check and walked out into the spring sunlight. It was Saturday, and Linda, when he met her at the drugstore corner, had on a Saturday dress and a bright smile to match. With the dreadful and unwanted affections of Lothar Remsdorf removed, she was again her age of the early 20s. They talked little of the times when he'd first met her. She still did some competitive swimming. That was one of the things which had drawn Remsdorf to her initially, that she should start with him a new race of beings based on her physical aquatic abilities and his physiological affinity for water. They had a nice Saturday afternoon, George and Linda. They walked in the park like so many other couples that afternoon, his arm around her supple waist. Regretfully, he took her back to her boarding house early after supper. He was working on a Sunday feature about the disappearing trolley car, and deadline was approaching. It was 9 p.m. when he unlatched his apartment door and saw the yellow oblong of a telegram lying on the floor. The message was from his uncle. It was terse and to the point. It had been sent that morning. Remsdorf escaped hospital during night. Whereabouts? Unknown. His uncle's use of the word escaped meant to George that Remsdorf was not supposed to be by any means through with his official hospital visit, in the opinion of hospital authorities. George sat down in a chair by the window and tried to think. He discarded the idea of calling Linda up and warning her. After all, Remsdorf supposedly did not know the girl's address. He wondered, as he had before, at Remsdorf's persistence. Originally, it had been none of his affair. Beyond his affection for Linda, there was no reason why he should risk his job and his life battling someone so entirely monstrous and determined as Lothar Remsdorf. And yet he knew he would continue to battle him until one or the other of them would be done forever, if only for Linda's sake. Public officials are fearful of highly placed pressure, George knew, and dependent as they are for their livelihoods on votes and patronage, they are sometimes easier to handle than private citizens. If this whole grisly thing could be forced into the spotlight, and why couldn't it? He'd had trouble pleading his case with McBrien, but what about the publisher of the Gazette? He was the man to see. Not a small, wizened, penny-cautious milquetoast like Pelgrim's city editor. Instead, he would see the Gazette's owner, and see him soon if it were humanly possible. It was a tossing and turning night for George. He heard the city sounds gradually put themselves to sleep, until finally there was nothing to keep his troubled mind occupied but the square of light on the ceiling, reflected from the street lamp outside and below. He'd seen his publisher only once before. The occasion was when he'd been a cub, and it concerned the legal aspects of his report on a jumped or fell story. Publisher Toller was a flint-eyed man with a raspy voice and a huge chart of circulation hanging behind his chair. You stood in his presence and you spoke only when spoken to. In the small hours of the morning, Pelgrim got up and drew himself a glass of water. On his way back to bed, he paused for a moment beside the window and looked out. The street was deserted, except that lounging against the base of a lamp-post across the way was a man. He was small, nondescript, but his eyes were turned upward toward George's floor and his own window. The reporter went back to bed, frowning. The next day, George made his desire known to city editor McBrien. The other raised his eyebrows. "If you've got any bright ideas about how you're worth more to this paper, I'm the man to see, and the answer is no." George hastily assured him he was not interested in seeing Mr. Toller to ask for a raise. McBrien ferreted around and grumbled when George refused to give his reason. "Either you get the appointment from me or I'll do it through his office direct," was Pelgrim's ultimatum. The city editor mumbled something about ungrateful young pups. A few days later, the reporter received word from the publisher's office that he'd been granted a 15-minute appointment in 2 weeks. Pelgrim cursed at the delay, but the tone of the note allowed no argument. Since the night he'd noticed the little man standing outside his apartment building, George had had the ever-increasing feeling that he was being followed. In the days when Remsdorf himself had lumbered after him and Linda, there had been no question. Now his pursuer was a shadow that came and went, something to be seen out of the corner of one's eye, so lacking in substance that not once again had George been able to get a true picture of a face or form. If he walked at night down a long street, though, there were always footsteps or a figure somewhere back of him in the gloom. If he taxied, there was another cab behind. It was because of this George had avoided going to Mrs. Brumley's to see Linda. This enforced separation from her made him unhappy. Their conversations made him unhappy. "Hello, Linda, dear." "Hi, George." "I'm not coming up, and you'd better stick close there." He tried to hide the news about Remsdorf, but he suspected that she guessed. Several times he pleaded with her. "Why not get out of town? You're in the clear. You've got those relatives in the West." But she wouldn't, and when he asked her the reason, she said, "Well, never mind." But he thought he knew, and it pleased him because he certainly felt the same way too. He finally told her that he thought he was being tailed. No, not by Remsdorf, he hastened to add. Did she miss him? Sure did. It was pretty tough just sitting around up there, wasn't it? Well, she read a lot, but couldn't she see him? Meet him somewhere? No, not now. "I'm doing what I think is right," he always ended their phone conversations with, and she replied yes, she knew it, and believed in him. Then they always said small, tender things to each other at the end, just before he hung up. She to go back into her vacuum of loneliness, her virtual exile at Mrs. Brumley's, and he to match steps and shadows with his pursuers. Although his work hadn't suffered noticeably, George had been in the office little the last week or so. McBrien grumbled, and one or two of his fellow workers joked about it. There were things happening upstairs, the rumor was. It was a good time for a guy to be very much seen and on the job. George shrugged, paying little attention. After all, it was tomorrow he was seeing the publisher. 2. 11 a.m., the memo from the office had said, and George was sitting in the elaborate anteroom at 10 to 11. He remembered his old-time shyness with Mr. Toller with some contempt. That was the anxiety of extreme youthfulness, he reasoned. This time he'd talk out from the shoulder. He'd say, "Mr. Toller, I have the biggest story of this sheet's history. You may think it's a daring thing to print, and there are a lot of reasons why it can't be printed, but there are more reasons why it must be." At precisely 11, A buzzer rang on the receptionist's desk, and she beckoned to him. "You may go in now." He opened the door and went inside, shutting it behind him. The room was good-sized and looked as if it belonged in a private home rather than an office building. It was book-lined. There were wall-length drapes hanging beside the windows. Mr. Toller was standing in the center of the room. George had never seen him standing before. He looked tall and thinner than Pelgrim had remembered. Toller was speaking. "Understand from Mr. McBrien you have something of the greatest importance to say to me. Under the circumstances, felt that you should. The new publisher." A wave of the hand. "He thought by all means that you should be heard." George's head spun, and he found himself unable to look away from that grinning face sitting behind the publisher's desk. The desk that used to be Toller's, but was no more. From a fantastic distance, Toller's voice droned on. "The new publisher, Lothar Remsdorf. Mr. Remsdorf, this is one of our best reporters, George Pelgrim." Sitting there behind the publisher's desk, his mountain of flesh oozing over the arms of a mahogany chair, his pudgy hands clasped before him on the mahogany, staring unblinkingly at Pelgrim, grinning. Stories flooded through George's mind, bits of office gossip. The newspaper was Toller's life and blood, family tradition and all that, meant more to him than his own life. And now this tall, austere, spare man was acting deferential. He was nobody anymore, no publisher, no business, just a man standing there in the center of the floor. Remsdorf waved his hand.
"Thank you, Mr. Toller. Thank you. Now I'm not going to trouble you to stay here with us any longer. I shall listen to Mr. Pelgrim's important, thought myself."
Toller bowed his head servilely and walked from the room. So the gossip George had heard murmured downstairs for the past few days was true. A change in management.
"Yes, I'm the new owner of this newspaper,"
boomed Remsdorf.
"I hope you're going to enjoy working for me, Pelgrim."
There was silence between the two for a moment, and then the big man asked,
"Where is she?"
The relief must have showed on the reporter's face, for Remsdorf's frown was sudden and terrible.
"I'll find her," he gritted. "Early or late, but find her I will. She's to be mine. You understand, Pelgrim?"
There was a strange, unwholesome light that glittered for a moment beyond the black opacity of the fat man's eyes.
"Where is Linda Mallory?" the giant repeated. "I'll make a deal with you, George Pelgrim. I want her, and quickly. I know you know where she is, and I think you know that I shall eventually find her, but perhaps you can save me time and trouble. Even an hour saved in my quest is worth anything."
The big, doughy hands clenched and unclenched. He continued, softly.
"I know men's minds, Pelgrim. I know that you believe yourself to be in love with this girl, and in all probability she with you, but I assure you that it is not written in destiny that you two shall belong to each other. I've told you that that girl is entirely necessary to me. A pretty face, a pretty figure, Pelgrim, you can find those anywhere. Thousands, millions of them. You're young. There'll be other girls. Dozens of them. Linda Mallory is a necessary part of something that an average human such as yourself could not understand. But contemplate, if you can, Pelgrim, with your everyday mind, the implications involved. You know, I think, that I am not quite like other men. My life force is in different balance. It is probably no secret from you that I quite baffled the medicos in a certain Canadian hospital by the fact that through my veins, instead of blood, courses what 3 learned men described as a water-like serum. My organs and their functions confounded them,
and their pathetic instruments. The fat man's body quivered and shook with inner mirth. He raised his hand from the desk where it had been lying, and George's eyes were fascinated by the small pool of moisture that was revealed. Linda has certain abilities that will complement my own. She is the other part of my plan to rear a new race on this earth. Playfully, the May wind tugged at the drapes behind the publisher's chair. George stood like a statue, as though in a trance. This monster man exerted a strange, overpowering influence. The reporter noted the beads of moisture on Remsdorf's flaccid face, and as he watched, Pelgrim felt a knot of nausea tighten in his stomach. This preposterous creature before him, this absurd, macabre, wholly terrifying blob of protoplasmic monstrousness. He watched fascinatedly as a drop of water fell from a pudgy forefinger. How appropriate was the appellation he'd pictured for his newspaper story, the Damp Man. The other watched him closely. "I think I amaze you, George Pelgrim," he rumbled. "But have you ever thought that a race of such as me would be nigh invincible? You know that I am all but indestructible." His laugh was a wet rumble inside that cavernous body. "Be reasonable. Here is my offer. Surely you know." He waved an arm to include the room and the whole building. "I have no interest in the newspaper business, but it amused me to buy Toller out. It means so much to him. And yet, as we philosophers say, every man has his price, eh? Now, Pelgrim, I will make you editor of this paper. I will make you publisher of this paper, if you wish, and step aside myself. Plus," he flapped his hand in the air, "the payment to you of any reasonable sum, I say, which you may want. In return, bring Linda Mallory to me." "How do you know I can?" the reporter spoke. "I have great confidence in your abilities," answered Remsdorf. "My guess and belief is that she's in this city, although so far my agents have failed to locate her." "You're responsible for having me followed?" "Oh, yes," admitted Remsdorf. "Yes, I've got you under night and day surveillance, Pelgrim. Think over my offer. Make this decision the right way, and you'll be set for life. And, as I said before, there are so many other girls in the world." George cleared his throat. "I don't need to do any thinking. The answer is no." "I don't need to remind you that I'm now your employer," said the other man sibilantly. "I can fire you, Pelgrim, at a moment's notice, and I can fix it so that you get no other job in this town." He leaned forward ominously, his great shoulders hunched. "Or just about anywhere else. Think the whole thing over, and there are worse things I can do." "Oh, incidentally, what was the idea you came up here to talk to Toller and me about?" George smiled bitterly. "Skip it. I don't think it would appeal to the new management." Pelgrim left and went downstairs. He passed McBrien's desk on the way to his own, and the city editor leered at him suspiciously. George sat for a while, tinkering with his typewriter, staring off into space blankly. There was a macabre awfulness about the thought of that fat octopus sitting upstairs. Toller, whatever his unpopularity, had been a newspaperman through and through. Remsdorf had bought him out for only one reason, just a pawn, just another step in his attack against Pelgrim and toward Linda Mallory. One thing was very sure. He couldn't see the girl now under any circumstances. He must even be careful about phone calls made to her. He wondered if Remsdorf had enough official pull to have a tap placed on his apartment phone. That night, he called her from a pay booth and watched to see that the sallow little man dogging his trail was not near enough to decipher the clicking as he dialed Mrs. Brumley's. He told Linda tersely what had happened, and he pleaded with her again to leave town. She cried a little over the phone, and said no, she wouldn't leave, but she had to see him. They argued a nickel's worth, and George felt the frightening hopelessness of trying to persuade her. To quiet the girl, he promised that he would try to get up there sometime that night. He hung up and brushed past the slouched figure of the trailer in the drugstore door. The man hunched his shoulders and followed in pursuit. George took a bus across town, but the little man followed him. He took a cab, switched cabs in midtown traffic. His pursuer was similarly agile. He disappeared down a subway and tried to time his charge into an express. The little swarthy man squeezed through the doors too, though. They sat inside, the little man indifferent, while George glowered at him. They reached the end of the line, and George slipped into a movie house. Back of him, he heard the sound of someone else fumbling to a seat. The theatre was sparsely populated, and after a little while George got up and started back up the aisle. He saw no one until he got into the lobby, but then, his heart leaping with hope that he'd shaken the swarthy man somehow, slowed with discouragement. The little fellow was making a phone call in a booth, all the while his eyes fixed on the aisle mouths. George darted sideways, and the phone booth door slammed open. He ran up steps to the mezzanine level, hearing the soft pad of feet behind him. There was a red sign saying restrooms. He ducked for it. The room was tiled, dingy, and Pelgrim wrinkled his nose distastefully. But there was one break. It was completely empty, except for himself. He slid behind the door and waited. For a moment nothing happened, and George matched mental acrobatics with the one who trailed him. The other man's first instinct, of course, was to wait outside. But then almost immediately would come the suspicion that possibly there might be another way, if only a window opening onto a court, or an escape. The metal door swiveled inward. George waited only to recognize his man, and then he swung hard. The vicious blow caught the little man under one ear and crashed him to the tiled floor. George bent over, his fists ready, but there was no further need. The guy was out cold. Pelgrim whipped out the door and down the steps. He went out front and hailed the first cab he saw. He gave Mrs. Brumley's address and settled back on the cushions, massaging his bruised knuckles. They were halfway there when habit caused him to turn around and peer out the window. Out of the sea of traffic behind, there was one cab that stuck with them, turning when they turned, accelerating and slowing when they did. George's heart sank. He countermanded his first order to the cabby and gave his own address. The little man evidently had another little man following him. He might have known that Remsdorf's resourcefulness would foresee the ambushing of one agent. He got out at his address and saw the other cab stop up the block and expel a single passenger. It gave him some satisfaction to note that this man was medium-sized and heavy. He hoped fervently that the other fellow would be nursing a bad neck and jaw for several days. George hesitated a moment, undecided whether to go upstairs and make his call or not. Then he tramped into the corner delicatessen. He got Linda and told her exactly what had happened. "I'm sorry I can't come," he said tiredly. "You're all right as long as I stay away from you. But I guess that's the way it'll have to be until we think up something else." The hurt in her voice was something he couldn't bear. He knew she was on edge and nervous. So was he. He cut her short and hung up. There was no use of the two of them beating at each other. He tumbled into bed exhausted and slept. His sleep was a black and orange and purple thing, first color and then noise. The noise was sharp and insistent. It poked and prodded him until the sleep was gone sufficiently for him to recognize the sound. It was his doorbell. He shoveled his feet into slippers, reached for the heavy piece of lead pipe he kept by his bed now, and scuffed into the hall. He opened the door. It was Linda. Even while he kissed her and felt the warm moisture of her tears on his cheek, he was thinking, good God, this has done it. She clung to him and talked on the way a woman does about not caring about anything else but being with him. All the time he was trying to think. She knew less than he did about this hulking abnormal who coveted her being and soul, and certainly this was no place for her. This settled it. They could have only a few moments. Thank the Lord he had some money here. You sit down, he ordered. I'm going to get dressed. We're leaving town tonight. He frenziedly piled a few essentials into a bag, threw his clothes on in the bathroom, and came back. She looked almost pleased sitting there in the chair. Her face lit up when she looked at him, in a way that made him happy. You did a terrible thing, he reproached, and then was sorry he'd said it. I know, she replied simply. He was not surprised at Remsdorf or any man becoming obsessed with this blonde girl. Her tall, well-formed beauty was breathtaking. He wrenched his thoughts back to their problem. Now listen, we're leaving. We're going to get to a station and get on a train and go out to your relatives. We'll get married as soon as we can. I know this is a hell of a way to propose to you, but this is a hell of a situation we're in. She squeezed his hand. She was going to say something, but the sound of squealing brakes drew his attention to the window. He stood there and looked down. There were two men standing in front of the house, and a cab had just drawn up. The cab door opened, and out of the black interior stepped Lothar Remsdorf. The three men talked a moment. They looked upstairs at his window, and then they walked towards the apartment house front, out of Pelgrim's sight. A second later, the house phone jangled. "What's the matter, George?" He turned away from the window. "It's our pudgy friend," he hastily explained to Linda. "Now look, we've got to go down the back way. Maybe they don't know about that yet. It's a chance. All set?" "All set." He showed her the back door. "Open it and stand by it. I'll be right back." The house phone was still jangling. George picked it up. "Hello?" Remsdorf's voice came to him.
"Pelgrim, I know you have some interesting company up there. I'd like to join you."
"Are you crazy? There's no one up here. And what the hell's the idea of waking me up at this hour?"
"I shall remind you that I am your employer."
The damp man's laughing gurgle came over the wire.
"Invitation or not, Pelgrim, we're coming up."
"Come on," bellowed the reporter. "Come up and see what a fool you've made of yourself." He slammed the receiver down and sprinted for the back stairs. Linda was with him, and they thundered down. On the first floor, the escape emptied into an alley. There was no one at the outside door. He pulled the girl along until they came to the alley mouth. Nothing in the street but the cab Remsdorf had come in, parked in front of the building. The two ran for it. He jumped in the back. "Hey, this is taken, mister." The hackster swiveled his neck. George waved a $10 bill. "Taken be damned. We're in a hurry to catch a train. Sick mother. Let's go." The cab ground into first gear and started off. They barely pulled away from under the streetlight when a yell went up from behind. They'd been spotted. "You're going to get me in trouble, mister," the driver protested. They turned two more corners, and then George ordered the car stopped. "We've changed our mind. Go back and pick up those guys if you want." He pulled Linda out. The perplexed driver started back the way he'd come. "We'll do better on foot. Get a subway 3 blocks up here near the park. That'll take us right to the station. Come on. Hurry." Behind them, an auto backfired, and a motor roared as they sprinted for the square of light heralding the subway stairs. They had crossed the last street, made the final curb, when Linda's hand wrenched out of his own. He turned desperately and lunged for her falling body, but clutched instead only a flimsy edge of dress. She fell heavily on the cement. He dropped the bag and bent down, ready to lift her up. "Darn it," she gritted through pain-whitened lips. "My ankle! On a stone." He helped her up, but she could hardly stand. She hobbled painfully. Back of them, 3 blocks away, a car came into view. "Quick," he said. The subway entrance was still 100 yards away, but the wall separating them from the park was here. He boosted her onto its top and vaulted up after her, the suitcase forgotten now on the sidewalk. They fell into the underbrush on the other side. He put his arm around her waist, and they made as much time as they could in the darkness and through the bushes. Behind them, they heard the squeal of auto brakes. He strained his ears over the noise of their own progress, and finally, the sounds that he feared came to him. The crash and crackle told him that their pursuers had spotted the suitcase and the place along the wall where they'd fled into the park. The ground was uneven. It was rocky in spots. Elsewhere the earth was soft. He could tell from the occasional swift intakes of breath that Linda was in pain with her ankle, but he had to hurry her on, helping her as much as he could with one arm around her waist. George had little or no idea where they were headed, but it mattered not at all, as long as they kept ahead of the gigantic and sinister Remsdorf and his 2 little agents. Finally, as though by mutual consent, they stopped, and George looked around them in a circle. On all sides, but far away, for they must now be nearly in the center of the park, he calculated, were the clustered pinpoint lights of the city. When for a second the reporter heard none but night sounds in the park around them over the thunder of his beating heart, he thought with a wild surging hope that they had eluded the 3. But then there was the crackle of a twig, and a bush shook itself off somewhere behind them. He knew they had to go on. Linda gasped when he suggested they start again. She bent over and rubbed her injured ankle. "How is it?" She didn't answer. He kneeled down and touched the limb himself. Her ankle was already badly swollen. The sounds of pursuit were louder, and through the trees he caught the faint but unmistakable wink of a flashlight coming towards them. Instinctively, the 2 turned and staggered forward. He realized now that after yesterday's rain, their progress was easy to follow for anyone with a lamp. Linda saw it first and pulled at his arm. Set in the side of a nearby hill was the open maw of a tunnel. He recalled that there had been a reservoir here, and this was one of the channels that had carried pipes to the pumping and purifying galleries. They reeled toward it and went inside. The ground was damp, and the air unwholesome in the tunnel, and as they walked, they bumped occasionally against the dripping walls. They trudged to the farthest end. Here the pipes ran upward, and there were rude steps leading to an inspection ledge some 15 or 20 feet above the tunnel level. Somehow they staggered up on the ledge and sank to its damp floor. George held Linda's head in his lap. She was shaking with the excitement of the ordeal and the pain of her badly injured leg. Then an arm of light quickly streaked along the tube for a minute, and they knew the 3 pursuers were already in the tunnel. By lying flat and against the wall, they could not be seen from below. Pelgrim put his fingers over Linda's lips, and they waited. Remsdorf and his 2 assailants were below their ledge talking, shining the flashlight around. Then the voices stopped, and the flashlight beam became fixed. The narrow steps had been discovered. Pelgrim knew it was Remsdorf coming up after them when he heard the first heavy, shuffling tread. The light grew brighter as the reporter gathered himself to spring. It followed the curve of the steps, and that was the one thing George counted on. It would be directed naturally at the first area to present itself to the eye, rather than searching inward towards the extreme corner near the wall where the 2 fugitives crouched. Remsdorf cleared the last step and stood, as George had predicted to himself, near the outer ledge, shining his torch directly forward. At that precise moment, Pelgrim leaped. He hit the fat man before there was a chance to even look or swivel the light inward. He drove with his shoulder and his arms, and great though the weight was of the damp man, he staggered under the assault and teetered on the ledge's rim. George made a last lunge, and a great wet hand flayed at him, just missed a hold on his coat. His opponent toppled off the ledge then, and George himself reeled. It was Linda's capable hands at his own shoulder that steadied him. Below, there was the crashing impact of Remsdorf landing on the tunnel floor. A curious, strange noise it was, almost a wet, splashing sound. The flashlight was also a victim of the fall, and then the first excited chatter of Remsdorf's two companions died away. There was complete silence. Pelgrim had no idea how long he and Linda Mallory sat huddled together on the ledge. Whatever its length, it was a pathetically cruel period of time, for it was a hopeful, almost glad space, only to be shattered by the first of those unmistakable footsteps on the stairs below, a sound that the mind tried to reject. Because how could a man fall better than 20 feet to a rock-bedded tunnel floor, and yet, those shuffling, approaching steps were unmistakable. And there were other sounds. Remsdorf was coming back this time in force. George crouched on all fours in the darkness, pushing Linda behind him. At least there was no flashlight this time. The sounds became stronger as they neared, and then without warning, the whole colossal, obscene weight of the damp man landed upon George, bearing him to the ground as though he were a child. He clawed his way partly free, only to have fists and knees and shoes in his face. Something hard, a blackjack probably, took him under the ear. He felt and heard Linda fighting desperately at his side against these evil forces. An elbow caught him in the mouth, tearing his lip, just as another and finally decisive weight thundered down on his head. 3. Time had neither meaning nor place in the blackness of the tunnel. When George became conscious, he was lying on his back on the ledge with the salt taste of blood in his mouth. He was alone. There was only the drip of water from the ceiling and walls. Painfully, he hobbled down the rough-hewn steps and felt his way out towards the tunnel's mouth. His watch, lacking a radium dial, availed him nothing. They could be hours ahead of him or merely minutes. He wondered of Linda and breathed a silent prayer for her. His eyes, grown accustomed to the gloom, picked up a patch of white in the tunnel bed ahead of him. That it was a square of paper was all he could see in the darkness, but he picked it up and held it tightly as he stumbled on towards the arch of light that meant the opening of the tube. It was, unthankfully, not minutes but hours. The light of dawn was just arriving in the sky. He studied the ground outside, but there were many footprints, and they were confusing. His head still scrambled from the beating. He had almost forgotten the most important thing, the piece of paper clutched in his hand. He looked at it. It was a page from Linda's address book, and scrawled rudely were two names written in lipstick. Somehow, he surmised, in the dark Linda had been able to scratch this note as they took her from the tunnel and drop it in the darkness. The letters were ill-formed. George sat on a rock and glowered at the piece of paper. The first letter was a V. The last seemed to be lift, but then the last letter ran off the page. It meant nothing to him. He crammed the note into his pocket and left the park. Pelgrim went to his apartment, washed and bathed his bruised body, and thought as he'd never thought before. An inspiration came to him after a quick breakfast. He slammed his hat on his head and took a cab to the Gazette offices. One or two of his fellow workers raised their eyebrows at his battered appearance, but without noticing he tore into the morgue, that filing room where research material is stored so essential to every newspaper. He looked up Remsdorf. Here in these files was elaborate advance data all collected, suitable for any occasion. even pre-written obituaries. He ran his finger down the material and finally found what he wanted. It was the fourth name down under real estate holdings that made his heart leap. View Cliffs. He tore at his coat pocket and looked at Linda's note again. Of course, that was what she'd meant to write. He left the file room running, to the astonishment of the supervisor, made his own office in Nothing Flat. Jim Crozier, who shared the room with him, was there typing industriously. "Jim, can I borrow your car?" Pelgrim panted. "It's life and death." "Why, sure, Georgie." The older man turned toward him. "You know my garage. Only this time when you come back, you might leave as much gas as you see in it when you take it out." Crozier whistled. "Hey, your face! What in thunder did you—" But George Pelgrim was gone, sprinting for the elevator. 25 minutes later, he was in Crozier's sedan, heading north along the Bryan Parkway. View Cliffs was upstate and on the coast. He knew the general location roughly. It took him 3 hours of hard riding to get there. A local gas station attendant waved his arm in the right direction. "You mean Remsdorf, the millionaire's place? That's right out overlooking the water on the cliffs." George found it, and it was the sort of place you can't reconnoiter in an auto, surrounded by a high wire fence. He cashed his car off a side road and looked the situation over on foot. There was a gate, but it was locked. The fence was high, and every part of it could be seen from the front windows of the ancient castle-like estate that squatted inside the acres like some outre beast. Beyond the house, the land dropped off suddenly, and against its granite sides the sea tumbled thunderously. George stayed out of sight until dark. Then he went to the tree he'd already picked out, shinnied up it, crawled gingerly out on the limb that just poked its outer bark fingers beyond the steel fence, and dropped inside the grounds. Although the night was dark, the reporter took no chances. He ran doubled over, dodging from tree to tree, until he reached an unlighted side of the huge old house. He tried darkened windows until one moved slightly under his fingers. He pushed the frame upward gradually, so it would not squeak, and then he crawled over the sill. He was just inside, with the window lowered back into place, when a shadow passed in front. It was, George could just make out, one of the men who'd accompanied Remsdorf the night before. As though making the rounds, the figure disappeared into the gloom around the corner of the building. As best he could, George explored the chamber he was in and the adjoining rooms. They were all empty and dark. Finally, though, a murmur of voices led him to a doorway which revealed a flight of stairs leading downward. As he crept down them, the voices grew louder, one of them unmistakably Remsdorf's. He turned a bend and crouched on a darkened landing above a large room that spread out before him. The scene was incredible, unforgettable. This room, originally intended for the furnace and service facilities of a huge mansion, had been remodeled into something of an experimental chamber. There was still a huge furnace and a somewhat smaller hot water burner in the corner, but otherwise the room had been transfigured. There were 4 persons in it now, one of them undoubtedly a companion of Remsdorf's from the previous night. The other was a stranger to George Pelgrim. He wore a white medical smock. He had a small black moustache and looked foreign. Remsdorf himself was lolling in a huge oversized steel tub, his shoulders and thick arms lumps of blue-white flesh. And on the table at the far end of the room, her blonde hair tumbling over its end, was Linda Mallory, strapped to the steel surface. Remsdorf was talking, apparently to Linda, although the girl gave little notice that she heard. She was lying on her back, looking fixedly upward, and from her expression, George suspected that she was either in a deeply shocked condition or under some form of sedation. The white-coated, moustached figure hovered around her, and even as the reporter looked, he fixed a tourniquet on her left forearm. The damp man pulled himself laboriously out of the huge tub and stood nude except for a breechcloth around his middle, while the one, evidently a doctor, made a small quick incision in his arm and nodded enthusiastically at the result. George's muscles stiffened as he heard a sob from Linda. She turned her head away from the scene about to unfold, and at that precise moment Pelgrim felt something hard dig into his back, and a voice said, "You again, huh?" He started to turn, but the revolver jabbed deeper into his spine. "None of that. March straight down." It was the twin of the gunman below, the other one from last night, the one Pelgrim had seen earlier making the rounds of the house. Remsdorf bellowed as the two came down the stairs. It was a bellow of triumph and amusement rather than rage.
"You're in time for a good show, Pelgrim. As your employer..."
His laughter rumbled wetly.
"I recommend it highly."
He directed his aides to tie George to a chair and waved away the accented little doctor who approached holding a hypodermic in one hand like a suggestion.
"Not yet. We want him to see what is going on. Time enough for him later."
Remsdorf postured before the reporter like a huge, bloated pollywog.
"You're about to see my fondest dream consummated. You have been a stupid and at times unwitting obstacle, but of course I have defeated you. Linda Mallory is mine, as I willed she should be. Perhaps it is only right that you followed us here and will now see the final chapter. I do not know, Pelgrim, whether you believed me or not when I said that I and Miss Mallory were about to embark on a great biological experiment. It is entirely true. We shall raise a new race of humans, a far more indestructible race, capable of powers and talents beyond the human ken. I myself am different, Pelgrim, as you know. I hope and believe it will be possible to make my difference Linda Mallory's difference. And then," he shrugged his shoulders, "a race of us which will eventually rule the world. The first prerequisite, though," he explained elaborately, "is to drain her veins, her organs, and her entire body of blood, which our present-day unimaginative scientists believe is essential to life. Instead, she will receive a transfusion of life fluid from me, and she and I will become one. It is not necessary. In fact, it would be useless to explain the scientific and medical factors involved here. Suffice it that you will be watching the world's greatest biological experiment, Pelgrim. It's entirely fitting that the last event of your life before, shall we say, your demise, should be of such momentous caliber." He motioned to the doctor. "You may proceed." The white-coated man moved swiftly to Linda's side and inspected the tourniquet on her forearm again. Linda struggled and tried desperately to turn her head far enough to look at George, but the thongs holding her were too cruelly tight. Remsdorf seated himself on a bench at the girl's side, and the doctor applied a tourniquet to his arm also. He then bent to a table and came up with a small shining knife and a length of rubber tubing with large needles affixed to both ends. He turned towards Linda's arm, and at his movement, George, with a tremendous effort, threshed mightily and toppled his chair over. In an instant, the two sallow gunmen were upon him, guns raised, but Remsdorf's sharp orders caused them only to right Pelgrim's chair. "I want him to see this," Remsdorf rumbled. The doctor, distracted by the sound, bent again to his work. George watched fascinatedly as the needle neared Linda's forearm vein. The reporter was watching so closely, straining so tensely, that when he thought about it afterward, the following sequence of events seemed somewhat muddled. At any rate, the gaping blue hole in the white-coated technician's head seemed to appear before the thunderous crash of sound came from the stairs.
Actually, the two must have occurred simultaneously, and the doctor sank soundlessly to the floor. One of the gunmen clawed wildly at his own pocket, and an explosive roar greeted his action. The other aide hurled himself at the stairs, only to be caught in mid-air by an impact that sent him reeling and kicking to the ground. Only then did Pelgrim turn his head away from the carnage, the three dead lying there. What he saw was the oldest, strangest man holding the biggest revolver he'd ever seen. As he stepped down the stairs and came into the basement room, he seemed to grow smaller. He was bowed slightly, and a mane of white hair came a quarter ways down his back. There'd been horror enough in that room, yet the greatest of all was on Lothar Remsdorf Jr.'s face as he stared past Pelgrim at the tiny, advancing figure.
"Father!"
The words hissed out, and the damp man rose, trembling in every fleshy part. "Yes," the little man admitted, and he advanced silently on his monster son, his eyes as he passed Pelgrim a blazing blue fury, not of this world. George was struggling furiously to work himself free from the chair, and had already managed to loosen one wrist. Linda lay rigid with terror. Meanwhile, the struggle of wills between the two men before him continued.
"You're dead,"
wheezed the fat man, backing away.
"You're dead. I know you are, because
you arranged for my death. Ah, but you, my son, you are not dead, and that is something which must be righted. I created you out of the brine, out of the molecule, and out of the protoplasm, and where other men return to dust, you will return to your medium." He motioned Remsdorf towards the steel tub, and hypnotically the giant man obeyed, easing himself into the water, while all the time his horror-dilated eyes were unable to leave the old man's face. Pelgrim was almost free now. One leg was loosening too. The old man went on. "You are in your coffin, your grave and your tomb, Lothar Remsdorf Jr. You shall be unable to return to this life." The damp man was as though paralyzed in the huge steel tub of water. Only his eyes showed movement as he followed the old man's backward steps. The gun was out of the ancient's hand now. He stopped in front of the huge hot water furnace. He took a pail and a shovel and opened the door. He heaped the pail full of live red coals, and then he stalked towards where his son waited for him, unmoving with the hypnotic terror that froze him in his watery vat. "No!" shouted Pelgrim with a scream that forced the words from his lips. But the old man paid no attention. The reporter's thoughts were for Linda, and he flung himself towards her, covering her face and her ears as best he could. Even as he did, the old man emptied the live pan of flaming coals into the tub. The water began to boil, but the screams of agony which Pelgrim expected were not forthcoming. Instead, the damp man's face grew less and then liquidated. His giant limbs and torso seemed to take up the gurgling boiling of the water until, as though in imitation, the all of him cooled and heaved and boiled and bubbled too. And then, entirely magically and impossible because Pelgrim had been watching every instant, there was nothing in the tub but the roil of still boiling water, and in the bottom, showing from under the now darkened coals, the breechcloth lying slack as a towel. The old man was gone up the stairs and into the night from whence he'd come, and Linda, thankfully, was sobbing in George's arms, while he desperately thought up some tale to comfort her, and to explain the disappearance of the evil being, Lothar Remsdorf Jr., a man who had perhaps never quite been, and who was now only a vanishing mist of steam around the dome light of the room, and beaded droplets against the high windows looking out to sea. If you enjoyed listening today, Be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the Join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,